Now, in our last section of the book, Hannah Arendt explains what happens when a totalitarian movement takes power and forms the government. She argues that perhaps the most important challenge that the totalitarian movement faces after taking power is it that it must confront reality. Because in its propaganda, in its technique of creating the future in the present, in isolating the individuals and transforming society into masses, it has created an image of ever growing, developing power that is simply, in real life, is simply not possible. But somehow it has to sustain that image. How then, when a totalitarian movement takes power, how it manages to sustain that image? And Hannah Arendt argues that by resisting stability and normalization of its regime, because this would stop the movement and liquidate the fiction of an ever developing power they had created through propaganda. It's a constant struggle for totalitarian leadership to maintain the masses' contempt for the outside world and against the status quo in the face of the reality and the restrictions imposed by having political power. Normalization and stability will actually destroy that shell which a totalitarian movement created through its propaganda. It will give the sense of normalcy, whereas totalitarian movement does not represent itself as something for the normalcy, rather something alternative to normalcy. The power in a totalitarian regime is not like a singular power. It is rather, it lies in a very complicated structure, and it shows a very complex relationship between the state and the party. One of the evidences that Hannah Arendt presents in our book is the example of duplication of offices in totalitarian regime and the coexistence of supposed and real power. This structurelessness of totalitarian regime complicates the supremacy of a leader. Though ideological line of the regime will insist that the will of the leader is the supreme law of the land, but power does not rest only with the leader. Moreover, because there is lack of successful palace revolts, some groups that might try to take over the power, because there is lack in that groups, a totalitarian regime in power presents itself not as a gang, rather as a regime that has control over all the groups and agencies of that society. It drives its power from the isolated, atomized individuals. But it does not, a totalitarian regime does not work in benefit of these individuals. And Hannah Arendt argues that this explains the seeming irrationality and inefficiency of totalitarian organization. An example of this inefficiency is the duplication of offices, which often results in contradictory orders and the bungling of administrative tasks. However, this inefficient power structure works well for the furthering of the movement, which is ultimately the goal of every totalitarian regime. Hannah Arendt presents an evidence that Nazis actually did not believe that German people were the master race, regardless of their propaganda that they told the masses. What they believed was that they were creating the master race that would rule the earth. The other aspect of a totalitarian regime is, in order to continue its totalitarian rule, it always needs an objective enemy. Enemies that are not enemies because they are against the state, but rather because of some aspects of their being, and they can be changed at any time. One relevant example would be of how the Modi regime is basically treating Muslims in India. Now, Muslims in India are not the enemies of the state, but some aspects of their being, perhaps being Muslim, is the enemy. And believing that it can be changed, like that whole movement of coming back to home, like forcefully converting the Muslims into Hinduism. It indicates that aspect, that this aspect of Muslims being can be changed back at any time. But it won't end here. Hannah Arendt argues that as soon as the Nazis murder all the Jews, they can merely declare another objective enemy to the movement. The secret police do not solve crimes. They round up those who government has declared an objective enemy for punishment or extermination. This is the most important need of a totalitarian government, to continuously create an objective enemy. The concentration camp, Rand further argues, is the prime example of totalitarian domination. It treats individuals as mere collections of instincts, reactions, and responses, and thus attempts to lure them to the level of animals. She argues that the concentration camps, are not only meant for indoctrination and degradation of human beings, but are also highly controlled and rational experiments in removing from human beings their spontaneity and freedom, transforming them into something even less than animal, into a thing, depriving human beings not merely of their freedom of movement and choice, but of the spontaneity of itself, of life, spontaneity of life itself. And it is only possible in the absolutely total domination of concentration camp, where every aspect of life itself can be controlled and manipulated. In all, by explaining and having all this analysis, Hannah Arendt still questions if totalitarianism is a form of a modern government or is it a new form of politics itself? In answering this question, she begins by discussing the totalitarian conception of the law. Totalitarianism seems to have broken with the common law of man. But rather than replacing that with its own common law, it claims to be the purveyor of natural and historical law and identifies law with man. Whereas for positive law, nature and history are sources of stability and authority. For totalitarianism, they are the movement itself, and thus all laws are laws of the movement. The other aspect of a totalitarian regime is to create terror, fear, through violence, through psychological warfare, through propaganda. And the purpose of the terror is to realize the law of the movement. This means, she argues, paradoxically, that terror stabilizes or freezes men into inaction so that the rules and laws of nature and history can move freely, unhindered by human spontaneity. This has perversely solved a problem of political thought. Since government is based on lawfulness and is therefore supposed to be stable and unchanging, how does one account for and deal with the movement of the body politic and its citizens? In the completed totalitarian government, all men become one man, and terror ensures the continuation of the movement, such that all actions become the acceleration of the movement of history and nature. Another aspect of totalitarian movement as well as totalitarian government is ideology. And ideology is the tool that accomplishes this task of creating terror and sustaining terror and fear and freezing the human spontaneity, creating an unchanging environment. And this ideology becomes the tool. According to Hannah Arendt, ideologies are not concerned with being, but with becoming. There are three characteristics of all ideological thinking that Hannah Arendt argues have been proven by totalitarian transformation of ideologies. First, they claim total explanation of a process of what becomes and are always oriented towards history. Second, and this is very important, ideological thinking is independent of all experience and is unable to learn from experience. This second element allows it to claim to be truer and then reality and construct a world of fiction. This element of ideology claims to be truer than reality and construct a world of fiction. Third, ideologies have no power to transform reality. An ideology starts from an axiom or premise, for example, that all history is the history of the development of race and deduces the law of motion of history from it. According to Hannah Arendt, this logical consistency does not exist in reality. The world itself is not actually created by a strictly logical process that has a single correct starting point. In order for ideologies to change reality, they must be able to understand reality. but their dogmatic belief in a single first principle that can explain all of history and nature makes it impossible from them to actually understand the world. This characteristics of ideology or ideologies amounts to complete dedication and submission to the so-called logic of history. Since all people exist only as a tool to the continuation of the logical movement of history, to what Hannah Arendt calls becoming, all freedom is crushed. Freedom is the ability to begin, the ability to move between men, contingency and individualism. All of these phrases used by Hannah Arendt to describe freedom can seem mystifying, but they are all an attempt to refer to the real spontaneity of people in the practical world. Some other aspects of totalitarian regimes are also discussed in detail by Hannah Arendt. But I think so far we have already discussed the most important aspects of Hannah Arendt's theory of totalitarianism, her analysis, how she analyzed the historical events that contributed to anti-Semitism and imperialism, and how then imperialism actually contributed to totalitarianism, and how then a totalitarian government works. Now, after having this lecture, and I've been giving you examples of relevant regimes just to relate to our contemporary times and to better understand the functioning of a totalitarian regime and of a totalitarian movement. But I will try to record case study so that you can better understand how a totalitarian regime works in contemporary times. And those case studies will be my own analysis. One doesn't have to agree with that analysis. But those are just for our comprehensive discussion that we can have in our online class.